Thank you so much for joining us and being with us today. I'm Dawn Michelle Whitehead, and I'm the Vice President of the Office of Global Citizenship for Campus, Community, and Careers at AAC&U. And I want to welcome you to the third webinar in this series. I am so pleased to partner with CILMAR, the Center for Intercultural Learning, Mentorship, Assessment, and Research in this endeavor. And as I have mentioned in previous webinars, this partnership started in 2019 when Chris Atchison-Clare, under her leadership, convened a group to discuss professional development for interculturalists, broadly defined. And that included those of us who work in the space of global learning, those who worked in multicultural education, intercultural communication, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that conversation has resulted in a number of collaborative activities, including this webinar series. So we are so pleased that you are here today. And as you know, this webinar is based on the work of the AAC&U Value Initiative. And unlike some of our other webinars, it's not about scoring, whether it's about the application of the rubrics in unique ways to improve teaching and learning. And so, as you know, we will be focusing on the intercultural knowledge and competence and global learning rubrics in all of the 7 parts of this webinar series. Just a quick reminder, our next webinar will take place on February 7th. The topic is examining the knowledge of intercultural and global self-awareness. And that will take place again in February, and then you'll see the others that are listed for the rest of this series. Now, one thing I do want to mention is, we are all aware that an election took place yesterday, several elections for those in the U.S. context. As the results of those elections sink in, particularly the presidential election, we are reminded that 51% of the popular vote went for former President Trump, and 47.5% went for Vice President Harris. And as a result, we have seen some in the US and the world celebrating, others have expressed distress, and this clear political divide persists in the United States and on our campuses. And so it's important that we recognize the need for intentional, deliberative work around engagement across differences, including empowering and preparing students with intercultural knowledge and global learning experiences that help them speak and work across those differences. And with this urgency in mind, I'm going to turn it over to the facilitators for today's webinar, Dr. Aletha Stahl and Dr. Leslie Bozeman. I'll turn it over to you to kick things off.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us. Yep, let's get us started. We're going to start with our learning plan. There are 3 main components to this webinar. We're going to go over introductory activities with you, explore a couple of key concepts, and then discuss assessments. And after getting to know each other just a little bit and setting the stage for the sharing and interactions that are inherent to global and intercultural learning, we'll spend some time taking a look at the key concepts of the value rubric criteria for knowledge of cultural worldview frameworks. We'll share activities that can be implemented in both the curriculum and the co-curriculum, and then we'll spend some time discussing assessment and intercultural learning, the assessment of intercultural learning from different perspectives. And we'll aim to have a little bit of time at the end for Q&A. So very specifically, our intended learning outcomes for this session are that we would like for you all to be able to describe ways to communicate cultural worldview frameworks and how they are relevant in your own particular educational context. We'd also like for you to be able to identify an experiential or interactive learning activity that you can use or adapt to facilitate learners' knowledge of cultural worldview frameworks. And we would like for you to be able to select an appropriate method or tool for assessing knowledge of cultural worldview frameworks that aligns with learning outcomes, again, for your context. So we're going to just do some real quick introductions. Dawn introduced us briefly, and there's a little bit of information about us online. So we'll share just a tiny bit more. Again, I'm Leslie Bozeman. I have valued intercultural and global learning and international education and intercultural communication for almost my entire life, since I was a teenager. and I'm proud to have transformed an interest in those areas into a career. I serve as the Director of Curriculum Internationalization at IU Indianapolis. Our campus was previously called IUPUI, and our colleagues at Purdue University have their own campus in Indianapolis now. So the primary goal of my position is to enhance the capacity for global learning for faculty, staff, and students. And my colleague, Aletha.
I'm Aletha Stahl, and I serve as lead intercultural learning specialist in the Center for Intercultural Learning, Mentorship, Assessment, and Research at Purdue University, so CILMAR, one of the co-hosts of this series. And I came to CILMAR 6 years ago from a faculty position at a small liberal arts college, where I was able to both teach and lead programs of various kinds that focused on intercultural learning. And I came to Purdue to really broaden my understanding of all things intercultural in a different environment, to understand what internationalization means in a large context. And my position is very much curriculum and faculty facing. I lead workshops and develop curriculum and partner across all the colleges at Purdue.
So right now we'll start with focusing on our first intended learning outcome. And you'll see on the next slide that outcome is to describe knowledge of intercultural worldview frameworks. And this rubric criteria is relevance in one's own particular educational context. So while both Aletha and I have experience with the intercultural knowledge and competence value rubric, when we began to prepare for this webinar, we realized we had some questions, and our questions led to a good deal of conversation. So my colleague Aletha, I think, is going to, at this time, move through a respect activity with us that will help us to get into some of what I mentioned earlier, the setting of the stage that comes along with talking about intercultural and global learning. And it was definitely a good part of our conversation and our initial thought process. Aletha, you want to take it over from here?
Thanks, Leslie. Yes, so we decided that we would launch this somewhat differently than the previous webinars by having you be involved and meet somebody immediately in a breakout room. So this is a partner activity, and the purpose is really to introduce you to a partner, because we'll have an opportunity later to do another partner activity, and we hope to be able to maintain the same partners. And this will also introduce our topic. So what we would like you to do in your breakout room is briefly introduce yourselves to each other, and then discuss, what does it mean for you to show respect? And what does it mean for you to be shown respect? And you might think about behaviors, verbal and nonverbal communication, as you think about these things. I'll also note that although we're recording this session, the conversations that you will have in your breakout rooms will not be recorded. But we really want to thank Anita Digg-Carlin and Gwenaëlle Juan for being willing to stay in the main Zoom room and be recorded so that those who watch the video later can see the activities being carried out. And now I would like to ask Dan to put us in our breakout rooms.
I think we're good.
I think we stay here, yeah.
Yes. So do you want to introduce yourself first?
Sure. My name's Anita Digg-Carlin, and I'm the Director for Intercultural Learning at Wesleyan University here in Middletown, Connecticut.
Okay. And I'm Gwenaëlle Juan. I'm a fifth-year PhD student in comparative literature and at Purdue University. And I teach courses in English, French, and comparative literature. That's all I do.
Awesome. Yeah. Interesting. I teach Intro to Global Engagement, so very much along the lines of this. I love this activity. So I wrote down the question. It says, what does it mean for you to show respect? And then for you to be shown respect. Would you like to go first?
Sure. What does it mean for me to show respect? It's a difficult question. I will think about that in terms of how I interact with my students, for example. I don't necessarily view them just as students, but as human beings with, you know, like their own thoughts and more like as peers, even though I mean I am their instructor, so it means that like I value their opinions even if they are different from mine. Yeah, I am willing to reconsider the content of the course or, you know, how I address an essay based on what they have to say, even if, for example, I give them a prompt about a topic and I don't necessarily would have answered the same way. As long as the argument is coherent and cohesive, I think I would like accept it. Um, and I think that valuing people's ideas is a form of respect because I think some people easily disregard what other people think. So that's one thing.
Hmm.
Then in terms of behavior, I think it
Yeah.
would like not to talk too much, let people talk and listen to what they have to say, and then I think talk because I think a lot of people have a tendency to speak and say everything they want to say, but not listen to what other people have to say. I think that's a form of respect too, to put yourself, you know, perhaps not on the forefront, but more like on a lower level and be willing to hear what other people have to say.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was I mirror, you know, many of the things that you said. And I guess in terms of I can be very practical because I'm actually my next thing on my agenda today is I'm going to teach a class of
Okay.
college students after our election. And so I feel like I have to really find a way to put what you've just mentioned into practice today. So I think what I'm going to do in order to make sure all voices are heard equally is, and to try to keep things calm, which I think is important with respect, is trying to manage the emotion. So my activity will be designed to minimize emotion, but also value equity, humility, voice, all that. So I'll just pass around a small piece of paper to each one. They can write their answer to a prompt, which I have to clarify, and then we'll toss the papers together and then spread them out so everyone will read someone's, but not their own. So I feel like that's putting into action, I think, some of the key concepts that you mentioned as far as, you know, listening and humility and all those different things. So that's how I'm going to try to show respect today because I think it's important. And what does it mean for you to be shown respect? Yeah, again, I guess another thing that comes to mind is just communication. I try to teach my students that, you know, the way that you treat your instructors is important as far as, you know, if you need extra help or you need more time or things like that. If you communicate and you share your own situation, people can connect to you better. And it kind of goes around to the almost like, you know, sharing story idea, where the more you communicate and share of your story, the more you're able to respect each other, I think. So again, that's in terms, I like that you put it in terms of something professional and classroom related, because if we think about it more personally, you know, I think it gets a little more challenging to talk about. And I really appreciate the question because, you know, it is, if you think about your family and how we teach our children respect and emulate it in our community is all quite important and very easy to, you know, point at others, but it's a little more tricky to think about in the sort of bilateral terms.
So I haven't really addressed the second question, to be shown respect, but I mean, I think it would be the same. Like, for example, if I give students feedback, like on an essay, I expect them to pay attention to it and not just like ignore it. But yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of like the same question. I think I expect from them to do what I do with them, but
So I'm curious to know what differences and similarities about respect emerged in your conversations. I see we talked about how it's important to treat others as they would like to be treated, so it may not look the same, right? And direct versus indirect style of communication. Aspects of respect that had to do with being present and giving someone your attention, acknowledging the other person. Many similarities, listening actively. Humility, taking the posture of a learner in whatever situation you're in, tone of voice, giving them your full attention. deep listening. There's a lot coming up here I see about care for the person, their well-being, conversation, listening. And we are taught what respect means as young people, listening for understanding. So I'm gathering that a lot of your conversations focused around listening, and that seemed to be something that was shared. I'm wondering if anything came up that might also have had to do with behaviors of respect, and then also how you account for differences and similarities that might have come up in your conversations. I think this is interesting. We spoke about forms of greeting, nonverbal cues, and eye contact, right? Treating elders and people of higher status, hospitality. So we know in some cultural contexts, eye contact means respect, and in others, it means disrespect coming from somebody who would be less, have lower status or be younger. Eye contact behavior differs. Yeah, thanks. So what forms our sense of what behaviors and communication constitutes respect comes very much from the environment that we're brought in, right? Up in, right? And what do you do when your understandings of respect differ? Cultural humility came up. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think it depends on the level of trust among the people involved.
Thanks. Get upset and talk about it. Yeah, depends on level of trust. So I wanted to start with this activity because it came up in a context when I had students talking about hosting friends. And one student said, to be respectful to my friends, you know, we're all in this together. And so we all bring food when I host them because, you know, they want to contribute. And another student said, absolutely not. To be respectful to my friends, I provide everything. So that comes very much from different cultural worldviews. And sometimes you have to walk away. Thank you. We don't always know, right? When somebody's demonstrating respect to us or not, when we don't share their worldview. And that's really the point that I wanted to make in this opening activity, is that there's no single understanding of what respect looks like in terms of behavior and verbal and nonverbal communication. And understandings of respect are shaped by cultural worldviews. And so knowledge of cultural worldview frameworks can help us negotiate and or adapt how we show respect and how we expect to be shown respect. And that very much came out in your answers about, you know, paying attention to what somebody else was wanting or expecting in the situation, listening closely, etc. Thank you all for this. And we're now moving on to our next section, which is focusing on our first outcome, which is describing knowledge of cultural worldview frameworks and its relevance in your particular educational context. And I'll turn it back over to Leslie for this section.
Great, thank you. And thank you everyone for participating in that activity. So our initial thought process when we took on this fantastic opportunity was to really take a look at the rubric, take a look at the criteria, and just to think about it, to see if we were thinking about it differently from how we had been earlier on in our use of the rubric. We started out by discussing the phrasing cultural worldview framework itself. And some of the questions that we asked ourselves were about the differences between a worldview and a framework in this context, whether we should be identifying and sharing specific worldviews or specific frameworks with you, and how our campuses had used this, how we have used this with faculty and staff on our campuses. We realized that we were really posing some questions to us that were making us rethink the rubric. And so we thought that if we were engaging in that kind of thought process, that you all might be too on your campuses, and you might take a look and have your own questions about exactly what do some of these things mean, how do we use this on our campus. And so we thought it might be a good way to start out by having a chat fall, that has you thinking about what does this cultural worldview framework phrase mean to you? So what does cultural worldview mean to you? For those who are not yet familiar with the term chatfall, it's a way for all the participants to share their thoughts in the chat all at the same time. So right now, so far in this webinar, you all have just been one at a time adding your comments whenever you're ready to share, and people can read as they're popping up. But what we're going to have you do is think about this. Think about, what does the term cultural worldview mean to you? What does a cultural worldview framework mean to you? Think about that on your own. Then type your thoughts into the chat, but don't press send. I'm sure there are some of you who are familiar with this, but others may not. You'll wait for my countdown to press send. And so let's start out by giving you all about a minute to form your thoughts and place them in the chat, but not press send. And then I'll count down from 3. And when I say go, you'll press send. So you can start your minute now. Okay, folks, a minute is up. And so 3, 2, 1, go. All right, we've got a lot of information coming through the chat. And because it's all coming through really fast, it'll take us another minute or so for you all to focus on it. So go ahead, take a look at what your colleagues and the other participants have shared. I see one's own perspective on the way the world works and how to make meaning as influenced by one's personal experience and community. Becky shared that with us. Hi, Kiara. I see cultural worldview for me is to be aware of cultural diversities in the world so that we are respectful of others. Let's see. Amani, hello, Amani, has written the beliefs, language, metaphors, and perceptions of reality that shape how we perceive the world and live our lives. Olga has shared behavioral preferences, I in relation to others, the way one walks through their identities and perspectives. I see Gwenaëlle has said a set of principles, moral, physical, cultural, that regulate how we interact with the world. There's some really great responses here. So as you were taking a look at what's in the chat, let's focus also on how AAC&U has described this in the rubric itself. And so here we have the general content of the criteria for knowledge of cultural worldview frameworks, demonstrates an understanding of the complexity of elements important to members of another culture in relation to its history, values, politics, communication styles. There are some very different concepts that I'm seeing in the AAC&U value rubric than what's in the chat. So history, politics, economy, how do those factor into one's cultural worldview in your perspective? So one of the things that we definitely realized as we were working through this on our own was that many different people will have different responses to the question, different perspectives on cultural worldview. You all are showing that in the chat. And I thought it might be interesting to consider when considering how cultural worldviews are manifesting in our educational context, to do a little informal survey of some of our colleagues around the field, and then also some professionals in other fields. So you see here on the screen, we've got that we mostly took a look at higher education folks, but that we do have some respondents to a very informal survey from Brazil, Spain, United States, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. Also Mexico. We've got some responses from Mexico as well. Some key takeaways from this, as we've already mentioned, is that not everyone interprets the term the same way. And so here are some of the different ways in which others thought of the term cultural worldview. For some, it was a filter. For some, they thought a worldview was an equivalent to a generalization or a stereotype of others. For some, it was a guide, how they walk through life, how something that orders their behavior. And for some, worldview was actually the experience of going outside of their country and learning about others. So here you'll see just a couple of the responses. It was a bilingual survey. We definitely had folks who responded in their own language. And so I've translated a response from Portuguese here for you that is especially relevant to some of our faculty who are on the call. Cultural worldviews are fundamental because they directly influence the way in which students understand and interpret linguistic and cultural content. And so we could remove linguistic and cultural content and we could just have content. Their worldview will influence how they understand, how they accept, how they interpret whatever it is that they're learning in class. And then we have a response from a nursing faculty member who has a clinical practice as well, who sees patients. So each time I visit with patients, it is a constant balance between what I aim to offer to support health and the beliefs and values around health held by my patients. And so here are two very practical ways in which cultural worldview impacts an educational context. So you'll see a QR code here, and the QR code will just provide you more information about the other responses in the survey. There's no activity to do with that right now, but it's there for you to grab and take a look at later if you'd like. So how are cultural worldviews relevant in your very specific context? So I saw earlier on, we have folks from study abroad. We have people who are focused on intercultural learning. We had faculty members from language. We had other people from international programs. So how do cultural worldviews surface in the work that you are doing on your campuses or in your specific context? We'd love for you to share just a response or two about that. Anecdotes are welcome. Ideas about different parts of the world, that comes into play when students are trying to determine where they're going to apply to a study abroad. Very true. I definitely have interacted with students who were afraid to go to certain places because of what they've heard about those places on the news. I was just in a virtual exchange course yesterday where some of the students from IU Indianapolis were saying they had no idea that they would have anything in common with their peers in the Ukraine, which is where their partners were located. And they would never have thought to interact with people in that country before because I thought it would just be so incredibly different. Let's see, we have race and caste and hierarchy are such prevalent concepts when working with international or multicultural students. Anita shared that with us. As education faculty, it is imperative we prepare teachers for the diverse classrooms in which they will be teaching. Thanks, Angela. Hi, Chris. Chris says that he asks his learners to choose a topic of their own interest and research it from at least 2 to 3 world perspectives. That's a fantastic learning activity for the students to do. And that's an activity that doesn't require the faculty member to be an expert in those world perspectives. It helps the students to bring that knowledge on their own. And so that's great because sometimes faculty are a little bit hesitant because of their own knowledge base. So you can have a course that takes into consideration other worldviews if you add it in as an assignment. Chris H. Sinclair has shared learners bring their worldviews into any learning context. So understanding worldviews is important for educators. Thanks, Chris. All right. So we've got some really fantastic responses there. I hope that you all are able to grab what you can from the chat that might be useful. Again, we really appreciate how vocal you all are being in the chat. Just a couple of extra points before we move into the second learning outcome. And that is some of the participants in the informal survey whose primary language was not English felt that they didn't understand the concept of cultural worldview at all as written in English to them, okay? And so this is something to definitely think about when you're using the rubric with international students, if you are going to be using the entire rubric or if you're going to be using terms from the rubric, is that some of your students may not actually understand what a worldview is. So one of the respondents from Spain said, this concept is so abstract, I don't know how to respond to it. And so the intercultural knowledge and competence rubric includes its own glossary of terms. And so it's really important not only for the instructor to use that for their own understanding of the tool, but also to clarify the terms and the concepts with the learners. That's essential. Okay, so now we're going to move into outcome 2, and that is to identify an experiential learning activity you can use or adapt with learners to facilitate the development of knowledge of cultural worldview frameworks. And we'll start off with an activity called examining cultural values. So the purpose of this activity is to engage learners in self-reflection and learning about others. And it addresses one of IU Indianapolis's dimensions of global learning. The dimensions of global learning are what we call on this campus our global learning outcome statements. So in your environments, there may be similar statements that you can align with this particular activity. The particular global learning dimension is to analyze one's own beliefs, values, assumptions, experiences, and or communication styles in respect to those of at least one other culture. So in facilitating interactive activities, I recommend, and others would as well, thinking about the level of risk or vulnerability required of the participants, because it can impact participation, it can impact how the instructor or facilitator debriefs the activity, and when during the timeline of a class or a program that the activity is used. So this particular activity, it could be anywhere from really low to high risk, but it's conceptualized right now to be low to medium risk, depending on how it's facilitated. And risk really is about how, for many students and many learners, how much they have to reveal about themselves. And it's subjective, so what is low risk to one person might be a little bit higher risk to someone else. So the activity instructions. So the activity has 3 main components: individual thought, some shared conversation, and then a compare and contrast. You can see the full instructions for the activity at the QR code, and I really hope that gets you where you need to go. All right. So we're not going to ask you to do this particular activity right now. We're going to ask you to do something a little bit different. What we'd like for you all to participate in is a discussion of how to use this particular activity in your context. And so there are 4 questions that we will ask to guide a conversation in breakout rooms. And they are: with what content or learning objectives would this activity align? Again, in your context, very specific. Where in the semester or program schedule could you see implementing this? And how might you need to adapt this activity for your context? And then what reactions can you anticipate from your students? And we have our same 2 volunteers who will do this activity here.
Content or learning objectives would this align with for your context?
Oh, okay. I lost the thing. I think he could. I mean, the good thing is that I teach literature, so I think this activity is very possible in a literature course, especially when you teach. So I teach comparative literature, English literature, like the Bible as literature, and French literature. So I did actually something sort of that invited students to reflect on their own culture, but it was not organized this way. But so I'm just going to describe what I did. But we studied a fable by Jean de La Fontaine in a French course. So he's a 17th century poet who wrote fables. So basically, it's a poem with characters that are animals, and each animal is a representation of a social class or a particular flaw. And one of them is the story of an ant and a cicada. And basically, the cicada sang during all summer. And then when winter is coming, the cicada can no longer sing and is asking the ant for money and support, but the ant refuses to help her, and so was asking who is wrong, or in the story, like is it the cicada because she hasn't worked during the whole year, or is it the ant for not helping? the cicada, and most of the students were telling me that the cicada was in the wrong because she's not working. And it's actually a modern understanding of the poem, because it's more like a capitalist understanding of it. If you don't work, then therefore you are to blame. But in the 17th century France, it was actually bad because the ant is not displaying like a Christian virtue, which is to help people in need. And so actually the cicada is a representation of the poet, and the cicada worked over the summer. So she actually worked. But so I was using that poem to show students how our perception of people's behavior and what is right and what is wrong evolves throughout the centuries. So it's just a tiny example that shows that I think I could apply that in class. But yeah, I don't know how to answer the question.
Yeah. I think for me, if I think about the one major sort of learning objective or topic that we address is the cultural self-awareness. When we talk about like basically introduction to intercultural learning in my course. And I think that I'll just talk a little bit about that, how that goes, which I think might also answer some of these questions. What I find is that in a group of diverse students, there are students who have very little understanding of their own culture and their cultural groups. Often the majority students, often the students who are, in my case, domestic students who haven't maybe left their home states or countries very much. And then, of course, the students who are more transplants or international are much more aware of their cultural belonging and whatnot. So I find this is challenging for students, and I've noticed that in an assignment, I assign them a cultural self-portrait, and then we ask them to display a visual aspect, like a visual interpretation of that cultural self-portrait. And I'm very thankful that I have the full semester, because I find that some of them really hesitate to do this. It can be very uncomfortable, and sometimes they have reactions. The students who are most comfortable sharing their cultures, have all these colorful, interesting things to say, and then other students feel like, oh, I'm so boring. Like they just don't understand. They haven't really thought into their own backgrounds yet. So it's nice to take some time and allow them to, I try to do like 2 or 3 a day for the next even 4 weeks. And then slowly you see the students I notice that they must be going back home and asking their parents a little bit more about like their own maybe immigration history and that. So I find that's, in terms of how to adapt the activity, I guess that's one adaptation that I have done, because of course I have the luxury of doing it throughout a semester instead of just in an hour and a half event, is what I'm first thinking of in terms of my course. I could think about it in terms of a shorter term, like staff faculty activity, where I think one thing that we are working on at our institution is just community building and creating belonging. And so activities like this are things that we're constantly looking for to, take things out of, sort of bilateral or simple work situations and complicate them a little bit more by getting to know each other a little better and unpacking some of our differences, and thereby finding, some really interesting commonalities.
I think the content of the course is a little bit different. But I see that perhaps I could use that activity before studying a text, and so that they could compare their worldview with the worldview that is represented in the text and how it differs. But and then if I have international students or students with like different social and cultural backgrounds, like how they could let's say the text represents a problem, a challenge that a society faces, how they each react to it, or what solutions they would develop.
I think this time I'll ask for volunteers who'd like to share aloud. You're more than welcome to also share in the chat, anyone who would like to say anything in the chat. But do we have a couple of volunteers who would like to tell us about the particular educational context that they might use this activity in, and then what were some of their responses to the questions. Jessica?
Hi, everyone. I'm Jessica Harding from University of Notre Dame, and I work in study abroad. And looking at this this activity, I was able to talk with Tamara, and looking at this activity, we both kind of thought it looked like a great this kind of way to introduce this kind of idea of culture to students. So like at the beginning of the maybe for my work, like maybe some of the pre-departure meetings with students. So before they arrive at their study abroad site, because it asks them about themselves and their perceptions about themselves. And that's a great first step of like trying to help build like cultural awareness. And then Tamara mentioned, and I don't want to speak for her, but I understood her saying that it would be great to like maybe even have this become the beginning of a conversation of like, how might someone from like where you're going, how might they answer this question? Like what might, and just have some students think about like some of the preconceptions or like stereotypes they have about where they're going.
Thank you, Jessica. I see some agreement with your comments in the chat about it being a good pre-departure exercise. Not only is it good pre-departure for a study abroad, it's a good virtual exchange module exercise as well.
And to talk about some activities that we think are helpful for Worldview, for helping students develop knowledge of cultural worldview frameworks. And these activities are in a collection that we have, and I've put a tiny URL there, and this is in the Intercultural Learning Hub. So if you don't have an account yet, you'll want to go to that tiny URL and then create an account, and you'll have access eventually to our slides and also to activities and assessments that are relevant to this webinar. But in the meantime, I'd just like to briefly talk about 4 activities, and you may also want to be thinking about activities that you like to use to teach knowledge of cultural worldview frameworks, and drop those in the chat. One of the ones that we frequently use at Purdue is the human values continuum, and this entails a series of continua, more or less, or 2 statements where the learners identify which one they lean towards a little bit more. And it's an opportunity for them to think about where they fall in terms of things like individualism and collectivism, how they view power and authority, and to compare that and think about different contexts for themselves and for the people around them. Beings Don't Have Culture is a simulation, in fact, based on an article that was written by scholars who were working from a northern context in a southern context, where they were ostensibly experts going in to support a community that grew beans and was having some challenges with bean growing, particular challenges. And it can be taught through the article or as a simulation. And it really helps learners think about the very different worldviews they bring, and also fosters cultural humility. Draw a House is an activity that helps learners think about the fact that how we structure space and conceive of space can be very different according to worldview. And then I'd like to run you through the commemoration activity, which is another excellent activity. And you can see here on the slide that there's a signpost, and this comes from Harlem in New York, US, for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard. There's a postage stamp of Mother Teresa from India, a statue of Nelson Mandela that is in Cape Town, South Africa, Victoria Falls from Zimbabwe, and Mao Zedong Memorial that is in Hunan Province, China, and then also a coin from Bolivar, and that comes from Venezuela. And the commemoration activity asks groups to discuss eminent people from their cultural group who have been commemorated after their death and how they've been commemorated. And these various images can help give them ideas of what a commemoration might look like. And then the groups would also discuss whether those people who are commemorated are representative of the demographic of the people in their cultural group, and how might culture affect who gets commemorated and how that commemoration occurs. And then also how commemoration contributes to collective cultural history and values. And then the person who wrote this activity added a question that can also be useful to use, which is how might commemoration be used for or against social justice within a particular cultural context. So these are just some additional activities that you may want to consider. And I hope that you have, in fact, I suggest that we take a minute before we move on to assessment for you to add additional activities that you like. Maybe they're links from the Intercultural Learning Hub. Maybe they're ones that you know of that we might all Google later. And go ahead and just drop those in the chat. And we'll just take a minute here for you to do that. I see the Harvard implicit bias task. That's an interesting one. That association makes sense. Yeah. Asking students to create and then share a cultural self-portrait. Introduce a cultural group they belong to by sharing a meme or GIF. We have a second for the human values continuum. It brings in the Hofstede dimensions. That's right. And there are instructions for doing it virtually in the Intercultural Learning Hub. Great. Having students place themselves physically along a spectrum. Yes, and you can do that with the Intercultural, with the human values continuum also. That's great. The YouTube ethnography project. Excellent. Adapt or be yourself. And a collection and open source of interactive activities to incorporate in new or existing programming. Intersectionality activity out of Australia. Yeah, these are wonderful activities. Thank you all, and feel free to keep adding as I speak. I see that we have a rich, a wealth of activities and knowledge on this topic in the room already. So we'll move on to outcome 3 now, which is to help you select a method or tool for assessing knowledge of cultural worldview frameworks that aligns with your learning outcomes. And to do that, I'm going to offer a couple options, and then we're also going to do another activity. So first of all, I think of assessment in multiple ways. And one way is assessment as learning. That means that the learners learn by assessing themselves. And there are several tools that are available. And again, they're in that Intercultural Learning Hub collection, for which the tiny URL is there. And one of those is the cross-cultural checklist. And this is just a checklist of a variety of things related to history, politics, economics, et cetera, that somebody who is preparing to travel and stay in a new cultural community may want to look up in advance. So it helps them think in advance about the people with whom they'll be interacting and the space, and then also it illustrates the importance of having a framework for understanding cultural worldviews. The core cultural values and culture mapping activity is something somewhat similar to what we engaged in at the previous webinar on diversity. And it asks learners to place themselves on 2 continua, for example, on a continuum that shows individualism, just collectivism and individualism, so that they reflect on their values and identify value differences, but also discuss the complexity of values within any cultural community, including their own. And then I put the AAC&U Intercultural Knowledge and Competence Value rubric there because that is certainly something that you can give to students and have them rate themselves or discuss. And then I want to talk about assessment of learning, which measures learning against a standard. And that's often what we think of as summative learning, or it can be pre and post testing. And then also assessment for learning, which measures learning to generate feedback for educators and or the learners to inform and enhance the learning. And there are three different tools that I'll talk about here. One is the Cultural Intelligence Scale, and that does cost money, and it's a quantitative measure, and it looks at four constructs. And the one that I would focus on in relation to knowledge of cultural worldview frameworks is knowledge, as it's called, or the level of understanding of how cultures can be similar and different. Then there's the Intercultural Effectiveness Scale, and this is also proprietary tools, so it costs some money, but it can be free or discounted if you have an IRB and are using it for research purposes. It also gives a score, but it also produces a learning plan that the learners can fill out on their own. It's a self-report, so it's good for pre and post testing, but there is no real direct measure of the knowledge of cultural worldview frameworks on it, but the factors related to self-awareness, exploration, world orientation, and relationship development seem to have a very strong correlation to what we would consider knowledge of cultural worldview frameworks. And then I bring up again the AAC&U rubric, and I'd like to move us to an activity for this. So I'm going to somewhat contradict, I apologize, Dawn Michelle, what you said at the beginning about not using the rubrics just as tools for rating and coding, because I think it can sometimes be useful, at least it was for me, coming from a faculty position, to actually experience what it's like to apply and work with coding and rating using a rubric, because that was something I tended not to do in my particular work. So what I would like us to do now is spend a minute looking at the first quote that I have there. And I'll simply note that I have already pre-coded, so these quotes have been selected for you from student work. And so I consider them to address in some way knowledge of cultural worldview frameworks. But if you could decide and then drop in the chat whether this particular quote would be rated as the benchmark level, so it demonstrates a surface understanding of the complexity of elements important to members of another culture in relation to its history, values, politics, communication styles, economy, or beliefs and practices, whether it demonstrates a partial understanding of the same, an adequate understanding, or a sophisticated understanding. So just go ahead and drop what you're thinking in here. And thanks, Dawn. That is not a contradiction. I'm seeing a number of 2s in here. So we also have a 1. And this is all good. I'm not giving an answer on this, okay? I'd like us to look at number 2 then and do the same thing. Curious people will start to ask questions about other cultures and their traditions. When they get the answers to the questions, it gives them a better understanding of that culture. Because of this, they now understand how to interact with someone from that culture because they know how people from that culture interact, what they believe is right and wrong, and this helps them to be respectful. Circling back to our respect activity at the beginning. 1, 2, 3, or 4 for this second quote. Seeing 3s, some 2s, partial, some adequate, partial, yeah. Okay, so we seem to be hovering between 2s and 3s. I wanted to do this activity just to demonstrate some of the challenges, but also the usefulness of actually using the rubric in this way. And when you're coding or rating using any of the constructs on the rubric, This can be super useful for written or even recorded assignments, right? Because you can now get quick transcripts and apply this. So reflective journals, discussion posts, videos involving student reflection. But as we noted, it involves subjective interpretation. So if we were really to take a lot of time with this, we would probably want to either have just one person rate and work towards consistency across the data samples, or have all of us discuss how we interpret partial, adequate, sophisticated, etc., and come to some kind of consensus around it to establish more inter-rater reliability. So this was just an example of how you might apply this for research purposes, or even to understand how your students seem to be responding to what you hope that they're learning, your learning outcomes.
Great. Okay, so we're nearing the end of our session, and this is actually the last formal piece of our presentation. And it is an example of another way to use the value rubrics. So I have already mentioned a little bit earlier the IU Indianapolis dimensions of global learning. And so the dimensions of global learning are an institutional set of global learning outcomes, and they were created from the campus's initial international learning goals. So there was a set of outcome statements called international learning goals when I arrived in my position. And they were about 10 years old by the time that I got here, or within about a year of me arriving. And so what we did was we took a look at those international learning goals, and then we also looked at both the intercultural knowledge and competence value rubric and the global learning value rubric and a couple of other sources to reconceptualize those goals to become the dimensions of global learning. And so the value rubrics are valuable for institutional initiatives as well. With this particular set of global learning outcomes, they are not required. This came out of the Office of International Affairs. And so we are not requiring that faculty use them. It's a guide, it's a tool, it's a helpful resource for them to be able to develop their courses, to assess their courses, to use with reflection type activities. But we did rely heavily on the concepts that were in the value rubrics. And if you go to the global learning outcomes, the dimensions of global learning, you'll see some similar language. And so these were a really great guide for us in putting those statements together.
Thank you all for your wonderful participation. And I'm sure I'll be going back and looking at this to get some ideas for workshops that I lead. So thank you all.
You all have been an absolutely fantastic audience, great participants. It's been so nice to see all of your contributions in the chat. We really appreciate it. It's what makes this kind of engagement really valuable.